Welcome to the Drowsy Economist. I'm glad you found your way here tonight. This channel exists at the intersection of learning and rest, a place where the often overwhelming world of finance and economics is transformed into something gentle, something soothing, something that allows your mind to wander and settle as you drift towards sleep. Over the next 2 hours, we'll explore the history of money together, not with urgency or excitement, but with the kind of measured, deliberate pace that invites relaxation. If you find yourself learning something along the way, wonderful. If instead you find yourself drifting off into peaceful sleep, that's wonderful too. There's no wrong way to experience this content. Before we begin our journey, if you enjoy this format, these long, calm explorations of financial topics, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. It helps others discover this quiet corner of the internet. And now, let us turn our attention to money itself and the very long, very quiet story of how it came to be. Money, as we know it today, did not simply appear. It emerged slowly, gradually, across thousands of years and thousands of miles, shaped by human needs that were themselves quite simple. People wanted to trade. They wanted to exchange what they had for what they needed. And in that basic desire, in that fundamental human impulse to swap one thing for another, the entire edifice of our modern financial system began to take form. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back, far back, to a time before coins, before paper, before any formal notion of currency existed at all. Let us go back to the beginning. In the ancient world, and we're speaking now of a time roughly 10,000 years ago, human societies were beginning to shift. For millennia, humans had been nomadic, moving from place to place, hunting animals and gathering plants. But around 10,000 BCE, something changed. Agriculture emerged. In the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, in what is now modern-day Iraq, people began to settle. They planted crops. They domesticated animals. And for the first time in human history, they stayed in one place long enough to accumulate surplus. This surplus changed everything. If you grow more wheat than you can eat, you suddenly have something valuable, something others might want. And if your neighbor has raised more goats than they need, well, perhaps an exchange could be arranged. You give them wheat. They give you a goat. This is barter. And for a long time, barter was enough. But barter has problems. Quiet, subtle problems that only reveal themselves slowly. Imagine you're a wheat farmer and you need a goat. You find someone with goats, but they don't want wheat. They want pottery. So now you need to find a potter who wants wheat, trade your wheat for pottery, then trade that pottery for a goat. This is what economists call the double coincidence of wants, and it's cumbersome. It's slow. It requires that two people at the same moment want exactly what the other has to offer. And so, gradually, certain items began to emerge as intermediary goods, objects that most people wanted, or at least could use, objects that could be traded for almost anything. In Mesopotamia, around 3000 BCE, barley became one such object. Barley was useful. You could eat it. You could feed it to animals. You could brew it into beer. And because it was useful to nearly everyone, it became a common medium of exchange. But barley had limitations. It was bulky. It could rot. It was difficult to transport in large quantities. And this is where things become interesting, because the Mesopotamians, practical people that they were, began to develop a solution. They began to keep records. In the ancient city of Uruk, archaeologists have uncovered clay tablets dating back to around 3200 BCE. These tablets are covered in cuneiform script, wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay with a reed stylus. And what do these tablets record? Debts, transactions, quantities of barley owed by one person to another. In essence, these clay tablets represent some of the earliest forms of written record keeping, and they were created not to record poetry or prayers, but to track economic obligations. Think about that for a moment. Writing itself may have emerged, at least in part, because humans needed a way to remember who owed what to whom. The very act of recording debt predates much of what we think of as civilization. Before great literature, before historical chronicles, there were receipts. These tablets served a function that would become central to the concept of money. They represented value without having to physically transport that value. If you owed someone 50 bushels of barley, a tablet could record that debt. The barley itself could remain in storage, safe from rot and theft, while the tablet, a small portable object, could be transferred, traded, even used to settle other debts. This abstraction, this separation of value from physical goods, marks a crucial turning point. Money, in its most essential form, is nothing more than an agreed-upon representation of value. It doesn't need to be intrinsically useful, like barley. It simply needs to be recognized, accepted, and trusted by the people who use it. Now, as Mesopotamian civilization grew more complex, so too did its economic systems. By around 2500 BCE, the Sumerians were using standardized units of weight to measure precious metals, primarily silver. Silver had advantages over barley. It didn't rot. It could be divided into small amounts. It was rare enough to be valuable, but common enough to be practical. And importantly, it was desired not just in Mesopotamia, but in neighboring regions as well, which made it useful for long-distance trade. Silver was weighed on scales measured in units called shekels. A shekel wasn't a coin, not yet, but rather a specific weight of silver, roughly 8 grams. If you wanted to buy something expensive, you would measure out the appropriate weight of silver, and the transaction would be complete. This system worked well enough, though it required carrying scales and it required trust that the silver was pure and not mixed with cheaper metals. Records from this period show remarkable detail. Temple archives contain thousands of tablets documenting loans, interest rates, and commercial contracts. Interest rates, incidentally, were quite high by modern standards, often 20% or more per year. But this was a risky world where crops could fail and trade routes could be disrupted by war. High interest rates reflected high risks. It's worth pausing here to consider the role of temples in early economies. Temples weren't just religious centers. They were economic hubs. They stored grain, managed large estates, employed workers, and issued loans. In many ways, temples functioned as the first banks, providing a secure location for storage and a trusted institution for managing wealth. The priests who ran these temples were, in effect, some of the world's first financiers. As we move forward through time, and we'll be moving slowly, savoring the details, we'll see this pattern repeat. Institutions emerge to manage money. Trust becomes valuable. Systems develop to make exchange easier. In these early Mesopotamian cities, money is still quite simple. It's barley in storage. It's silver weighed on scales. Its debts recorded on clay tablets that will survive, buried in desert sands, for 5,000 years. Here in ancient Mesopotamia, the first stirrings of monetary systems are beginning to take shape. The world is still small, still local, but already humans are discovering the abstract representations of value, whether marks on clay or weights of metal can make life easier, trade smoother, and societies more complex. And it is from these humble beginnings that we begin to see money spread beyond the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, carried by traders and travellers to distant lands. As trade routes expanded outward from Mesopotamia, so too did the concept of money. By around 2000 BCE, the Bronze Age Mediterranean was becoming increasingly interconnected. Ships crossed the seas carrying tin from distant lands, copper from Cyprus, precious stones from Egypt. And with these goods came ideas about how to measure value, how to conduct trade across linguistic and cultural boundaries. In Egypt, along the fertile banks of the Nile, a different system was taking hold. The Egyptians used a unit of account called the daben, which, like the Mesopotamian shekel, was a weight of metal, in this case copper or later silver and gold. A daben weighed roughly 91 grams and it could be divided into smaller units called kite. But here's what's interesting. Archaeological evidence suggests that actual daben weights were rarely exchanged in daily transactions. Instead, the daben functioned more as an abstract unit for accounting purposes. Egyptian workers, those who built the pyramids for instance, were paid in rations: bread, beer, oil, cloth. These rations had values assigned to them in daben, which allowed for record keeping and standardization, but the physical metal often remained in temple treasuries or royal storehouses. This is another step in that crucial abstraction we discussed earlier. Money becoming less about the physical object and more about the agreed-upon value the object represents. Egyptian records from the New Kingdom period around 1500 BCE show something else quite remarkable: the existence of what we might call a mixed economy. Alongside the official system of rations and state-controlled distribution, there existed a vibrant market economy where individuals traded goods among themselves, using those daben values as reference points. A worker might trade his ration of grain to another worker for sandals, with both parties calculating the relative values in daben to ensure fairness. This flexibility, this ability for money to exist simultaneously as a state-controlled tool and as a medium for private exchange, would become a defining characteristic of monetary systems throughout history. Governments want to control money, to issue it and manage it, because controlling money means controlling economic activity. But individuals want to use money freely, to trade as they see fit. And the tension between these two impulses, state control and individual freedom, shapes virtually every monetary system that has ever existed. Now let us travel east to the Indus Valley, in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. The Indus Valley civilization flourished between roughly 3300 and 1300 BCE, and it left behind some of the most sophisticated urban planning of the ancient world. Cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro had grid-pattern streets, advanced drainage systems, and standardized weights and measures. These standardized weights are significant. Archaeologists have discovered carved stone cubes, precisely shaped, following a binary system where each weight is double the previous one. The smallest weight is approximately 0.856 grams, and they scale up from there: 1.7 grams, 3.4 grams, 6.8 grams, and so on. This standardization suggests a sophisticated trading culture, one where precise measurement was valued and enforced. We don't know exactly what the Indus people used as money. Their script remains undeciphered, so we cannot read their records. But the existence of these weights, combined with evidence of long-distance trade with Mesopotamia, suggests they had developed some system for facilitating exchange. Perhaps it was based on grain, as in Mesopotamia. Perhaps it was based on precious metals. Perhaps it was something else entirely, lost to time. What we do know is that by around 1500 BCE, the Indus Valley civilization was in decline, and new peoples were moving into the Indian subcontinent. With them came new languages, new cultures, and eventually new ideas about wealth and value. Meanwhile, in China, yet another monetary tradition was emerging. The Shang dynasty, which ruled from approximately 1600 to 1046 BCE, left behind elaborate bronze vessels, oracle bones inscribed with early forms of Chinese writing, and evidence of a highly stratified society. During this period, cowrie shells, small smooth shells from marine mollusks, began to be used as a form of currency. Cowrie shells had several advantages. They were durable, portable, and difficult to counterfeit. They were beautiful, with a natural glossy finish that made them aesthetically pleasing, and they were rare enough in inland China to be valuable, but common enough in coastal regions to be obtainable through trade. For centuries, cowries served as money throughout China and indeed throughout much of Asia and Africa. The Chinese character for money is itself derived from the pictograph for a cowrie shell. Even today, thousands of years later, this ancient symbol persists in the written language, a quiet reminder of a time when the most sophisticated civilization in East Asia conducted its commerce with seashells. But cowrie shells, like barley and like weighed metals, had limitations. As trade volumes increased, as economies grew more complex, the need for something more practical became apparent. And this brings us to one of the most important innovations in the history of money, the coin. To understand the significance of coinage, we need to appreciate what came before. When using weighed metals, every transaction required scales. It required someone with the expertise to assess purity. It required trust that the metal being offered was actually what it appeared to be. These requirements slowed commerce and created opportunities for fraud. A merchant might mix silver with cheaper metals, hoping the buyer wouldn't notice. A buyer might use inaccurate scales, shortchanging the seller. These were constant concerns. The invention of coinage solved these problems elegantly. A coin is simply a piece of metal that has been stamped with a mark, usually by a government or other authority, guaranteeing its weight and purity. Instead of weighing and testing metal with each transaction, you could simply count coins. The authority that issued the coin stood behind its value. If the coin said it contained 1 shekel of pure silver, you could trust that it did, because the issuing authority's reputation depended on that trust. This innovation emerged in the ancient kingdom of Lydia, in what is now Western Turkey, sometime around 600 BCE. The Lydians lived in a region rich with electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver that could be found in the rivers flowing down from the mountains. For generations, people had been collecting this electrum and using it for trade, weighing it out just as silver was weighed in Mesopotamia. But around 600 BCE, during the reign of King Alyattes, the Lydians began doing something new. They began stamping pieces of electrum with official marks. These early coins were irregularly shaped, not the perfect circles we think of today. They were crude, really, lumps of metal with a lion's head stamped on one side and a punch mark on the other. But they represented a revolutionary idea, standardized government-backed currency. The system was refined further under King Croesus, who ruled Lydia from approximately 560 to 546 BCE. Croesus, whose name would become synonymous with wealth in the ancient world, introduced another innovation. He separated gold from silver. Instead of coins made from naturally occurring electrum, with its variable gold-to-silver ratio, Croesus issued pure gold coins and pure silver coins. each with guaranteed weight and purity. This made accounting easier and trade more transparent. The impact was immediate. Lydian coins spread rapidly throughout the Mediterranean world. Greek city-states began minting their own coins, each stamped with distinctive symbols. Athens used an owl, representing the goddess Athena. Corinth used a winged horse. These symbols weren't just decorative, they were guarantees. A coin bearing Athens's owl meant the Athenian state stood behind its value. And with coinage came something else, something subtle but profound. The coins themselves became a form of propaganda. A king's face on a coin reminded everyone who held power. A religious symbol reinforced civic identity. Coins were small, portable pieces of state authority, passing from hand to hand, spreading influence and reinforcing social order with each transaction. By the 5th century BCE, coinage had become widespread throughout the Greek world. Each city-state minted its own coins, and the diversity was remarkable. In Athens, the tetradrachm, a silver coin worth 4 drachmas, became the standard for international trade. These coins were struck from silver mined at Laurion, where thousands of slaves labored in underground tunnels to extract the precious metal that would fuel Athens's golden age. The Athenian tetradrachm was recognized and accepted throughout the Mediterranean. A merchant in Sicily would accept it. A trader in Egypt would accept it. This widespread acceptance was crucial because it meant that Athenian coins functioned as something approaching an international currency. For the first time in history, a single form of money could be used across vast distances, transcending the boundaries of language and culture. But acceptance of a currency depends on trust, and trust depends on consistency. The Athenians understood this. For nearly 2 centuries, from roughly 510 to 330 BCE, Athens maintained the weight and purity of its coinage with remarkable discipline. A tetradrachm, minted in 500 BCE, contained the same amount of silver as one minted in 350 BCE. This consistency was not accidental. It was policy, and it made Athenian currency the most trusted in the ancient world. Other city-states were less scrupulous. There was always a temptation to debase the currency, to reduce the precious metal content while keeping the face value the same. A government facing financial pressure, perhaps from war or famine, might mix silver with copper, creating coins that looked like silver but contained less actual precious metal. In the short term, this allowed the government to mint more coins and pay its debts. But in the long term, it destroyed trust. Once people realized a coin contained less silver than advertised, they would discount its value or refuse it altogether. This problem, the debasement of currency, would recur throughout history, in civilization after civilization. It represents one of the fundamental tensions in monetary policy, the temptation for those who control money to inflate its supply, and the inevitable erosion of trust that follows. The Greeks also developed something else during this period: banking. In Athens, trapezitai, literally tablemen named for the tables where they conducted business, began offering financial services beyond simple money changing. They accepted deposits, they made loans, they facilitated payments between parties without the physical transfer of coins. If you owed money to someone in another city, you could pay a trapezite in Athens, who would arrange for his counterpart in that other city to pay your creditor. The coins never moved, but the debt was settled. This is another form of abstraction. The money exists somewhere, but the actual transaction happens through record-keeping and trust. The trapezite keeps a ledger. He knows who owes what to whom. and as long as everyone trusts his records, the system works. It's more efficient than physically transporting heavy coins across dangerous roads. It's faster, and it opens up possibilities for more complex financial arrangements. These Greek innovations, standardized coinage, international currency, banking services, spread throughout the Mediterranean as Greek culture itself spread. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in the late 4th century BCE, he minted enormous quantities of coins to pay his soldiers and administrators. These coins, stamped with Alexander's profile, circulated from Greece to India, unifying disparate regions under a common monetary system. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his empire fragmented, but the monetary practices he had spread remained. Now let us turn to Rome. The Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire would take these Greek innovations and expand them to an unprecedented scale. Early Rome in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE used bronze bars called as signatum as currency. These were heavy, rectangular ingots stamped with crude images, a cow, a pig, sometimes a sword or shield. They were unwieldy, but they served their purpose in a still agricultural society. As Rome expanded and came into contact with Greek cities in southern Italy, the Romans observed the advantages of coined money. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome began minting its own coins. The denarius, a silver coin introduced around 211 BCE, would become the backbone of Roman currency for over 400 years. The name denarius, incidentally, comes from the Latin word for 10, because it was originally worth 10 asses, the as being a smaller bronze coin. Roman coinage became remarkably standardized. As the empire grew, coins minted in Britain were identical to coins minted in Syria. This standardization facilitated trade across enormous distances. A merchant in Londinium could trade with a merchant in Antioch using the same currency, backed by the same authority, trusted in both locations. The Romans also developed sophisticated banking practices. Argentarii, money changers and bankers, operated from shops in the Roman Forum. They handled deposits, made loans, and conducted auctions. They kept detailed account books, recording every transaction. Some of these records have survived, preserved in the ruins of Pompeii, giving us a remarkably clear picture of Roman financial life. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of Roman money is what happened during times of crisis. When the empire faced financial strain, and it often did, given the enormous costs of maintaining an army and administering vast territories, emperors resorted to currency debasement. The silver content of the denarius was gradually reduced over the centuries. Under Augustus, in the 1st century CE, a denarius contained about 95% pure silver. By the 3rd century CE, under the Severan emperors, it contained less than 50%. And by the time of Gallienus, in the 260s CE, the so-called silver denarius was almost entirely bronze, with just a thin wash of silver on the surface. This debasement caused exactly the problems one would expect. Prices rose. People hoarded old, high-quality coins and spent new, debased ones. This phenomenon, where bad money drives out good, would later be described by Thomas Gresham in the 16th century and become known as Gresham's Law. But the Romans experienced it firsthand, more than a millennium earlier. The debasement of Roman currency contributed to the economic chaos of the 3rd century CE, a period of political instability, military crisis, and near collapse of the empire. Emperors came and went with alarming frequency. The borders were threatened by Germanic tribes and Persian armies, and the money, the very foundation of economic life, was becoming worthless. The crisis was eventually resolved, though not without pain. The Emperor Diocletian, who ruled from 284 to 305 CE, instituted sweeping reforms. He issued new coins with guaranteed precious metal content. He attempted to control prices through decree, though this proved largely ineffective, and he reorganized the imperial administration to make it more efficient, if considerably more autocratic. His successor, Constantine the Great, continued these reforms. Constantine introduced the solidus, a new gold coin of high purity that would become the standard currency of the Byzantine Empire and remain in use for over 700 years. The solidus was so trusted, so consistently maintained in its weight and purity, that it became the international currency of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. Arab merchants accepted it. Germanic kings hoarded it. The word solidus would eventually evolve into soldier in English and sou in French, linguistic echoes of a coin that once represented stability in an unstable world. But while the solidus succeeded in the Eastern Mediterranean, the western part of the Roman Empire continued to decline. By the 5th century CE, economic activity had contracted dramatically. Cities shrank, trade routes became dangerous, and the sophisticated monetary economy that had characterized the Roman world began to fragment and collapse. When the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 CE, it marked not just a political transition, but an economic one. The unified currency that had spanned 3 continents was gone. In its place emerged a patchwork of local systems, some using remnants of Roman coins, others reverting to more primitive forms of exchange. Europe was entering what historians once called the Dark Ages, a term now considered somewhat misleading, as this period saw significant cultural and technological developments. But economically, there's no denying that the centuries following Rome's fall represented a step backward. The scale of commerce shrank, monetary sophistication declined, and for several centuries Europe would struggle to rebuild the economic systems that Rome had once taken for granted. In the centuries following Rome's collapse, Western Europe experienced what we might call a monetary drought. Coins became scarce. Gold virtually disappeared from circulation, hoarded by churches and the few remaining wealthy families. Silver became increasingly rare. What little coinage remained in circulation was often worn, clipped. People would literally cut small pieces off the edges of coins to collect the metal, or simply too debased to be worth much. In this environment, many communities reverted to barter or semi-monetary systems based on commodities. In some regions, cattle served as a unit of account. The old Germanic word for cattle, fee, would eventually evolve into the English word fee, reminding us that animals once represented wealth and payment. In Anglo-Saxon England, the vergild, the price paid as compensation for killing someone, was calculated in cattle or sheep. A nobleman's life might be worth hundreds of cattle, a peasant's considerably less. But barter and commodity money have limitations, as we've already discussed. As Europe slowly began to recover in the 8th and 9th centuries, the need for a more efficient monetary system reasserted itself. The Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne made the first significant attempt to re-establish a standardized currency in post-Roman Europe. In 794 CE, Charlemagne instituted monetary reforms that would shape European coinage for centuries. He established the livre, or pound, as a unit of account, not a physical coin, but a measure of value based on a pound of silver. The livre was divided into 20 sous, and each sou was divided into 12 deniers. These divisions, 12 and 20, seem strange to us now, accustomed as we are to decimal systems, but they were practical for the time. 12 divides easily by 2, 3, 4, and 6. 20 divides easily by 2, 4, 5, and 10. These ratios made mental arithmetic easier in an age when most people couldn't read or write. The actual coin that circulated was the denier, a small silver piece. It wasn't worth much. You needed many of them to buy anything significant. But at least it was standardized. Charlemagne mandated that deniers be minted at a consistent weight and purity throughout his empire. Royal officials checked the mints to ensure compliance. For the first time since Rome's fall, Western Europe had something approaching a unified currency. This system, incidentally, explains something curious about British money before decimalisation in 1971. The pound sterling was divided into 20 shillings and each shilling into 12 pence. This seemingly arbitrary system was a direct descendant of Charlemagne's reforms, a monetary structure that persisted for more than 1,000 years. The abbreviations used, pound, S for shilling, D for pence, came from Latin, libra, solidus, denarius, Roman terms for a Carolingian system used in Britain until the late 20th century. Money carries history in unexpected ways. But Charlemagne's empire did not long outlast him. After his death in 814 CE, the empire fragmented among his grandsons. With fragmentation came monetary fragmentation. Different regions began minting their own coins, often with varying standards. A denier minted in one region might contain less silver than one minted elsewhere. And so, once again, Europe descended into monetary confusion. Yet even as Western Europe struggled, other parts of the world were developing sophisticated monetary systems. In China, the Tang dynasty, which ruled from 618 to 907 CE, oversaw one of the most advanced economies of the medieval world. Chinese coins of this period were cast bronze, with square holes in the center, allowing them to be strung together on cords for easy transport. A string of 1,000 coins became a standard unit. These coins, inscribed with Chinese characters indicating the emperor's reign and the coin's value, circulated not just in China, but throughout East Asia. The Tang dynasty also saw the development of something revolutionary: paper money. The origin of paper money is somewhat mundane. Merchants who travelled long distances found carrying heavy strings of bronze coins burdensome and dangerous. So they began depositing their coins with trusted agents, who would issue them paper receipts. These receipts could then be redeemed for coins at the agent's branch in another city. Essentially, these were early forms of checks or promissory notes. At first, these receipts were private arrangements between merchants and their agents, but the government soon recognized their utility. By the 11th century, during the Song dynasty, the Chinese government was issuing its own paper money called jiaozi. These were official notes, backed by the state, redeemable for coins at government offices. China had invented paper currency more than 600 years before Europe would adopt the same innovation. The advantages of paper money were obvious. It was lighter than metal coins. It could be produced quickly when needed, and it allowed the government to increase the money supply without having to mine and mint more metal. But paper money also introduced new risks. A government could print far more paper than it had metal to back it. And if people lost faith in the paper, if they doubted the government's ability or willingness to redeem it for metal, the entire system could collapse. This is exactly what happened in China, repeatedly. Dynasties would issue paper money, then issue too much of it, causing inflation. People would refuse to accept the notes at face value. The system would break down. and eventually the government would abandon paper money and return to metal coins, only to repeat the cycle decades or centuries later. It was a pattern that would also emerge in Europe when paper money eventually arrived there, and in America, and indeed anywhere paper currency was tried. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, yet another sophisticated monetary system was flourishing. The Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries had created an empire stretching from Spain to India. This vast realm needed a unified currency, and it found one in the gold dinar and the silver dirham. These coins were based on Byzantine and Persian models but adapted to Islamic principles. Islamic law derived from the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad had specific rules about money and commerce. Usury, charging interest on loans, was forbidden. This prohibition shaped Islamic banking practices, encouraging different forms of financial arrangement. Instead of lending money at interest, an Islamic banker might become a partner in a business venture, sharing both risks and profits. Or they might structure a loan as a purchase and resale, with the markup replacing interest. These workarounds allowed for sophisticated commerce while adhering to religious principles, and the Islamic world became a center of trade, connecting Europe, Africa, and Asia. Arab and Persian merchants traveled enormous distances, bringing goods and ideas and coins from one region to another. The dirham, in particular, circulated widely. Thousands of Islamic coins have been found in Scandinavia, brought back by Viking traders and raiders who travelled down Russian rivers to reach the Caspian and Black Seas, where they traded with Arab merchants. In Europe, during the High Middle Ages, roughly the 11th through 13th centuries, economic activity began to accelerate. Population grew, agriculture became more productive, towns expanded, and with this growth came an increased need for money and for financial services to support commerce. Italian city-states, particularly Venice, Genoa, and Florence, emerged as banking centres. Italian bankers developed sophisticated techniques for managing money across distances. They created bills of exchange, documents that allowed a merchant to deposit money in one city and withdraw it in another, in a different currency, without physically transporting coins. This was similar to the Chinese system of paper receipts, developed independently half a world away. These bills of exchange were more than just convenient. They were essential for long-distance trade. A Florentine wool merchant buying fleece in England needed to pay the English seller, but transporting gold across Europe was expensive and dangerous. Instead, the merchant could use a bill of exchange. He would pay a banker in Florence who would issue a bill. The merchant would send this bill to England, where it would be presented to the banker's agent, who would pay the English seller in English currency. The banker made a profit from the exchange rate and from fees, and everyone else benefited from not having to ship heavy, vulnerable coins across the continent. This system required trust and sophisticated record-keeping. Italian bankers developed double-entry bookkeeping, a method of recording transactions that tracks both debits and credits, ensuring that accounts always balance. This innovation, first clearly described in a 1494 treatise by Luca Pacioli, a Franciscan friar and mathematician, would become the foundation of modern accounting. The great banking families of medieval Italy, the Medici, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, became enormously wealthy and powerful. They financed kings and popes. They funded wars and cathedrals. And they did all this not by hoarding gold, but by skillfully managing credit and debt, by keeping accurate records, and by maintaining trust across vast networks of agents and correspondents. The great banking families of medieval Italy were not the only financial innovators of their age. Across Europe, different regions were developing their own solutions to the perpetual problem of how to facilitate exchange without requiring constant physical transfer of coins. And perhaps nowhere was this more inventively solved than in medieval England, with a device so simple, so elegant, that it remained in use for over 700 years. The tally stick. A tally stick was, in essence, a piece of wood with notches cut into it. But these were not random notches. They were a precise recording system, a form of money and a method of taxation all in one. Let us consider how they worked, because the details reveal something profound about the nature of money itself. When the English crown needed to collect taxes, or when it needed to make a payment before tax revenues had been collected, it would issue a tally stick. The stick, usually made from hazelwood, which was abundant and had a straight grain, would be carved with notches representing the amount owed or paid. A large notch, the width of a palm, represented £1,000. A smaller notch, the width of a thumb, represented £100. A notch the width of a barley corn represented £20, and so on, down to notches for single pounds, shillings and pence. The stick would then be split lengthwise, creating two pieces that matched perfectly, like two halves of a puzzle. One half, called the stock, from which we get the word stockholder, went to the person who had paid money to the crown, or who was owed money by the crown. The other half, called the foil, remained with the exchequer, the royal treasury. Because the two halves matched exactly, with the notches lining up perfectly, they served as a receipt that could not be forged. You couldn't simply carve a new stick claiming the crown owed you money, because your stick wouldn't match the foil held in the treasury. Now here's where it becomes interesting. These tally sticks began to circulate as money. If the crown owed you £100 recorded on a tally stick, you didn't have to wait for the crown to pay you in coin. You could take that tally stick and use it to buy goods or settle debts with someone else. The stick represented a claim on the crown, and as long as people trusted that the crown would eventually honour that claim, the stick had value. It was in effect a form of government-issued money. This system had several advantages. It allowed the crown to make payments even when the treasury was temporarily short of coin. It reduced the need to physically transport heavy metal across the kingdom. And it created a form of currency that was difficult to counterfeit and easy to verify. For centuries, from the 12th century until 1826, tally sticks circulated throughout England, accepted in payment for goods, services and debts. The demise of the tally stick system is itself worth noting. By the early 19th century, Britain had modernized its accounting practices, adopted paper ledgers and abandoning the old wooden tallies. In 1834, the government decided to dispose of the accumulated tally sticks stored in the Houses of Parliament. Centuries of wooden records no longer needed. Rather than simply discarding them, officials decided to burn them in the building's furnaces. They burned so many, so quickly, that the furnaces overheated. The Houses of Parliament caught fire and burned to the ground. The magnificent medieval structure was destroyed because bureaucrats were too efficient in disposing of obsolete financial instruments. There's perhaps a lesson there about the dangers of moving too quickly to discard old systems. But let us return to the medieval period, when tally sticks were still in active use, and consider the broader context of medieval commerce. The High Middle Ages, from roughly 1000 to 1300 CE, saw a remarkable expansion of trade across Europe. Population grew, agricultural productivity increased thanks to innovations like the heavy plough and three-field crop rotation. Towns expanded, and with this growth came an increased need for mechanisms to facilitate exchange. One of the most important of these mechanisms was the trade fair. Medieval trade fairs were not casual markets. They were carefully organized events, held at specific times of the year in specific locations, where merchants from across Europe would gather to exchange goods. The most famous of these were the Champagne fairs, held in several towns in the Champagne region of France. The Champagne fairs operated on a sophisticated schedule. There were 6 fairs per year, rotating among different towns, timed so that merchants could travel from one to another in a continuous circuit. Each fair lasted about 6 weeks and followed a predictable pattern. The first week was for setting up and for merchants to display their goods. The next few weeks were devoted to trading cloth, then leather goods, then other commodities, and the final week was reserved for settling accounts. This last week, the settling of accounts, was crucial. Merchants would arrive at the fair having bought and sold goods on credit throughout the trading period. Now it was time to calculate who owed what to whom. Rather than each merchant paying each other merchant individually, which would require enormous quantities of coin and countless individual transactions, they would use a system of offsetting debts. Imagine merchant A owes merchant B 100 livres, but merchant B owes merchant C 100 livres, and merchant C owes merchant A 100 livres. Instead of 3 separate payments, all requiring physical coins, they simply cancel the debts. No money needs to change hands at all. Only the net balances, the amounts that couldn't be offset, would be paid in actual coin. This system of clearing debts, coordinated by professional money changers who kept track of all the obligations, meant that vast quantities of trade could be conducted with relatively little physical currency. The Champagne fairs became in effect a clearinghouse for European commerce, a place where the monetary economy of the continent was reconciled and balanced. Italian bankers, whom we've already mentioned, played a central role in these fairs. They not only changed money from one currency to another, necessary because every region minted its own coins, but they also extended credit, accepted deposits, and facilitated payments across long distances. A merchant from Venice could deposit money with an Italian banker at a Champagne fair and receive a letter of credit that could be redeemed with that banker's correspondent in London or Barcelona. The Champagne fairs flourished for about 2 centuries, from roughly 1180 to 1380. Their decline came gradually, the result of several factors. Wars disrupted trade routes. The rise of maritime trade reduced the importance of overland routes through France, and the development of permanent banking operations in major cities made the periodic gathering at fairs less essential. But while they lasted, the Champagne fairs represented one of the most sophisticated commercial systems of the medieval world. Alongside these fairs, another commercial network was developing in Northern Europe, the Hanseatic League. The Hanse, as it was known, was an alliance of trading cities stretching from the Baltic to the North Sea, cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, Bergen, and Novgorod. These cities banded together for mutual protection and to secure trading privileges. The Hanseatic merchants traded in bulk goods, timber from Scandinavia, furs from Russia, grain from Poland, cloth from Flanders, dried fish from Norway, salt for preserving that fish. These were not luxury goods but necessities, commodities needed in large quantities, and trading in bulk required substantial capital and sophisticated financial arrangements. The Hanse developed its own systems for managing money and credit. Hanseatic merchants used bills of exchange, similar to those used by Italian bankers, to transfer funds between cities without physically shipping coins. They established a common set of weights, measures, and commercial practices, which made trade more efficient. And they maintained contours, permanent trading posts in major cities, where Hanseatic merchants could store goods, conduct business, and live according to their own laws and customs. The Hanseatic League was not a state in the conventional sense. It had no king, no central government. It was a commercial alliance held together by mutual self-interest and by a shared culture of trade. And yet it was powerful enough to wage war, blockade cities, and negotiate treaties with kingdoms. For several centuries, from roughly 1200 to 1500, the Hansa dominated trade in northern Europe, demonstrating that economic power could rival political power. Within this world of expanding trade, of fairs and leagues and banking networks, money itself was becoming increasingly abstracted from the physical coins that represented it. A merchant's wealth might exist not as gold in a chest, but as entries in a ledger, as debts owed by others as shares in trading ventures. Credit was becoming as important as currency. Trust and reputation were becoming forms of capital in their own right. But trust, as we've noted, can be fragile. And in this world of expanding credit and increasingly complex financial arrangements, the collapse of trust could bring down entire institutions. The Italian banking families that dominated European finance in the 13th and 14th centuries would learn this lesson painfully. Before we discuss their downfall, however, we should consider another group that played a crucial, if often overlooked, role in medieval finance: the Knights Templar. The Templars were founded in 1119 as a military religious order dedicated to protecting Christian pilgrims travelling to the Holy Land. But over time, they evolved into something more: one of the first international banking networks. The Templars had several advantages that made them ideal bankers. First, they had a presence across Europe and in the Middle East, with fortified chapter houses in major cities. Second, they were trusted. They were monks, bound by religious vows, which gave them a reputation for honesty that secular merchants sometimes lacked. And third, they needed to move large sums of money to support their military operations in the Holy Land, which gave them expertise in international finance. Pilgrims travelling to Jerusalem faced a dangerous problem. They needed to bring money for the long journey, but carrying gold or silver made them targets for bandits. The Templars offered a solution. A pilgrim could deposit money at a Templar house in Paris or London and receive a letter of credit. Upon reaching Jerusalem, the pilgrim could present this letter at the Templar headquarters there and withdraw funds. The money itself never travelled, only the paper, and the Templars charged a fee for this service, generating revenue. This system expanded. Kings and nobles began depositing money with the Templars for safekeeping. The Templars made loans, charging interest, or rather, they structured their loans in ways that technically avoided charging interest, which was forbidden by church law, but which still generated profit. They managed estates. They collected taxes on behalf of monarchs. The Paris Temple, the Templars' headquarters in France, essentially functioned as the French royal treasury for a time. But this financial power made the Templars vulnerable. In 1307, King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the Templars, orchestrated their downfall. He accused them of heresy, charges that were almost certainly fabricated, and had the French Templars arrested on a single day, Friday the 13th of October. Under torture, some Templars confessed to the absurd charges. Their property was seized. The order was eventually dissolved by the Pope in 1312, and Friday the 13th has carried a superstitious weight ever since, though the connection to the Templars is perhaps more legend than historical fact. The destruction of the Templars removed one of the major players in European finance, but it didn't slow the growth of banking. If anything, it simply redirected financial power to other institutions, particularly the Italian banking houses we've already encountered. These families, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Acciaiuoli and others, had been operating for decades. But in the 14th century, they reached the peak of their power and influence. The Bardi family of Florence, for instance, operated branches in dozens of cities: London, Bruges, Paris, Naples, Cyprus, Rhodes, Constantinople, Jerusalem. They employed hundreds of people. Their ledgers recorded transactions in multiple currencies carefully converted and balanced. They financed trade in wool, grain, spices, cloth, and they lent enormous sums to monarchs, particularly King Edward III of England. Edward was engaged in what would become the 100 Years' War with France, beginning in 1337. Wars are expensive. Armies must be paid, supplied, equipped. Edward borrowed heavily from the Bardi and Peruzzi to finance his campaigns. By the early 1340s, the Bardi had lent Edward over £100,000 sterling, an astronomical sum equivalent to roughly a year's worth of England's total tax revenue. Edward kept promising repayment from future taxes, but those revenues didn't materialise, at least not in the amounts needed. In 1345, Edward effectively defaulted. He couldn't pay, and he didn't pay. The impact on the Bardi and Peruzzi banks was catastrophic. They had extended too much credit to a single borrower, and when that borrower failed to pay, their entire capital structure collapsed. The Bardi declared bankruptcy in 1346. The Peruzzi followed shortly after. Their depositors, merchants, nobles, guilds, even other banks, lost their money. Credit throughout Europe contracted sharply. Businesses that depended on loans from these banks couldn't obtain financing. Trade slowed. This was one of history's first true international financial crises, demonstrating that in an interconnected system, the failure of major institutions creates ripples that spread far beyond their immediate clients. The crisis was made worse by the Black Death, which arrived in Europe in 1347. The plague killed perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population within a few years. Economic activity collapsed as workers died and survivors fled cities. The combination of financial crisis and pandemic devastated the European economy for a generation. Yet from this wreckage, new banking families emerged, having learned from the mistakes of their predecessors. The Medici family, which we mentioned earlier, rose to prominence in the early 15th century. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici founded the Medici Bank in 1397. His son, Cosimo de' Medici, expanded it into one of the most successful banks in European history. The Medici were more conservative than the Bardi and Peruzzi had been. They diversified their lending, refusing to put too much capital into any single venture or borrower. They established branches across Europe, but each branch operated with some independence, preventing a collapse in one location from bringing down the entire network. And they cultivated relationships with the papacy, becoming the official bankers to the Pope, a position that brought both prestige and profitable business. The Medici Bank financed the Renaissance. When Cosimo commissioned Donatello to create sculptures, that was Medici money. When the architect Brunelleschi designed the great dome of Florence's cathedral, Medici financing supported the project. The bank's success allowed the family to become patrons of art, learning and architecture on a scale rarely seen before or since. But the Medici were also shrewd political operators. Cosimo effectively controlled Florence without ever holding official title as ruler. He influenced who was elected to office. He determined policy through a combination of wealth, patronage, and carefully cultivated relationships. His grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, would continue this tradition, ruling Florence in all but name, while presiding over one of the greatest cultural flourishings in Western history. The Medici Bank operated on principles that were sophisticated for their time. They used double-entry bookkeeping, a system that had been described by the Venetian mathematician Luca Pacioli in 1494 in his treatise Summa de Arithmetica. Double-entry bookkeeping requires that every transaction be recorded twice, once as a debit, once as a credit. This creates a check on accuracy. If the books balance, if debits equal credits, you know your records are correct. If they don't balance, you know there's an error somewhere. This might seem like a dry, technical detail, but it represented a revolution in how businesses could be managed. With accurate, systematic record keeping, merchants and bankers could track their financial position precisely. They could identify profitable ventures and unprofitable ones. They could detect fraud or theft. They could make informed decisions based on data rather than intuition. The development of double-entry bookkeeping was, in its own quiet way, as important as many more celebrated inventions. The Medici also understood something crucial about money. Its velocity matters as much as its quantity. Money sitting idle in a treasury does little. Money circulating through the economy, being lent, invested, spent and relent, creates activity and opportunity. The Medici kept their capital active, constantly seeking productive uses for it. This is one reason they were able to generate returns sufficient to support their lavish patronage, while still maintaining the bank's solvency. Alongside the great banking families, another institution shaped medieval economic life: the guild. Guilds were associations of craftsmen or merchants who worked in the same trade. There were guilds for weavers, for goldsmiths, for bakers, for shoemakers, for virtually every craft and trade practiced in medieval cities. These guilds regulated who could practice the trade, set standards for quality, controlled prices, and provided mutual support for members. Guilds also played a financial role. They maintained treasuries, funded from members' dues. These treasuries could be used to help members in distress. If a member fell ill or was injured, the guild might provide support. If a member died, the guild might help support his widow and children. In this way, guilds functioned as early forms of insurance and mutual aid societies. Some guilds also engaged in banking activities. The guild treasury might make loans to members, helping them purchase tools or raw materials. Wealthy guilds sometimes made loans to the city government or to other organizations. And because guilds often had their own meeting halls and secure storage, members might deposit valuables with the guild for safekeeping. The Arte di Calimala, the guild of cloth finishers in Florence, was particularly powerful. It controlled the lucrative business of importing rough cloth from Northern Europe, dyeing and finishing it to high standards and re-exporting it. The guild was enormously wealthy, and it used that wealth to exercise political influence in Florence. Many of the great banking families, including the Medici, maintained close relationships with the major guilds, recognizing that economic power and political power were deeply intertwined. As the 15th century drew to a close, Europe stood on the threshold of a transformation that would reshape not just its monetary system, but its entire relationship with the world. The age of exploration was beginning, driven by a combination of factors: the desire for new trade routes to Asia, the spirit of Renaissance curiosity, improvements in navigation technology, and not least, the perpetual European hunger for gold and silver. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish flag, reached the Caribbean islands. He thought he had found a route to Asia. He had not, of course, but what he had found would prove, from Europe's perspective, even more valuable. The Americas contained vast quantities of precious metals, and over the next century, those metals would flow into Europe in quantities that dwarfed anything that had come before. The initial Spanish expeditions to the Caribbean and Central America found some gold, enough to whet appetites and finance further exploration. But the real transformation came with the conquest of the great American empires. In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed in Mexico, and through a combination of military force, political maneuvering, and epidemic disease, conquered the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs had accumulated substantial gold, which the Spanish seized. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro did the same to the Inca Empire in Peru, carrying off even more precious metal. But these initial seizures, as dramatic as they were, represented only a fraction of what was to come. The real story of American precious metals begins in 1545, with the discovery of a mountain in what is now Bolivia. The indigenous people called it Sumac Urc, meaning rich mountain. The Spanish called it Cerro Rico, rich hill, and the city that grew up at its base was named Potosí. Potosí was quite literally a mountain of silver. The silver ore was so rich, so abundant, that for a time Potosí became one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the world. By 1600, Potosí had a population of over 160,000 people, making it larger than London or Paris at the time. The city existed for one purpose: to extract silver from the mountain and ship it to Spain. The mining was brutal work. The Spanish colonial authorities imposed a system called the mita, a form of forced labor adapted from Inca practices. Indigenous men were required to work in the mines for months at a time, deep underground in conditions that were dark, cramped, and extremely dangerous. Many died from accidents, from the dust that destroyed their lungs, or from exposure to mercury, which was used to process the ore. The mercury itself came from another source, the Huancavelica mine in Peru, which produced the mercury needed for silver refining. The amalgamation process, developed in the 1550s, involved mixing crushed silver ore with mercury, which bonded with the silver and separated it from rock. The resulting amalgam was then heated to evaporate the mercury, leaving behind pure silver. This process made it possible to refine silver ore that would have been too poor to work with earlier methods, dramatically increasing the amount of silver that could be extracted. The quantities were staggering. Between 1545 and 1800, Potosí produced roughly 45,000 tons of silver. To put that in perspective, that's more silver than all of Europe had accumulated in the previous 1,000 years. This silver was minted into coins at the Potosí Mint, then transported by mule train across the Andes to the Pacific coast, shipped to Panama, carried overland to the Caribbean, and finally loaded onto Spanish treasure fleets for the voyage across the Atlantic to Seville. This annual treasure fleet was one of the most important economic events in the world. Merchants, bankers, and governments across Europe watched anxiously for news of the fleet's arrival. If it arrived safely, loaded with silver, credit would flow and commerce would flourish. If it was delayed by storms or captured by pirates or enemy navies, financial panic could ensue. The entire European monetary system had become dependent on the regular arrival of American silver. And what happened to all this silver once it reached Europe? Some of it was coined and circulated as money, expanding the money supply dramatically. Some was used to pay for imports from Asia, Chinese silk, Indian spices, Southeast Asian pepper. The Spanish Empire ran persistent trade deficits with Asia, and silver was what Asian merchants wanted in return for their goods. Indeed, much of the silver mined in the Americas ultimately ended up in China, where it served as the basis for Chinese currency. But the flood of silver into Europe also caused problems that would fundamentally reshape economic thinking. As the quantity of silver increased, its value decreased. This is basic supply and demand. When something becomes more abundant, its price falls. But since silver was money, the falling value of silver meant rising prices for everything else. This phenomenon, known as inflation, was something Europeans had experienced before, but never on this scale. Historians call this the price revolution, and it unfolded gradually over the course of the 16th century. Prices in Spain roughly quadrupled between 1500 and 1600. Other parts of Europe experienced similar, though somewhat less dramatic price increases. For people living through it, the change was confusing and distressing. Workers found that their wages, even when they increased nominally, bought less than before. Landowners who collected fixed rents found their incomes worth less in real terms. Debtors benefited, as they could repay loans in money that was worth less than when they borrowed it. But creditors suffered correspondingly. The Spanish crown itself struggled with these dynamics. Despite the vast quantities of silver flowing from the Americas, the Spanish government was perpetually short of money. Wars were expensive, and Spain was almost constantly at war during this period, with France, with England, with the Dutch rebels, with the Ottoman Empire. The crown borrowed heavily from Italian and German bankers, pledging future silver revenues as collateral. But those revenues, when they arrived, were worth less than anticipated due to inflation. Spain defaulted on its debts repeatedly. In 1557, 1560, 1575, 1596, 1607, and 1627. Each default caused financial chaos among the bankers who had lent to the crown. There's a certain irony here. Spain controlled the source of more silver than any European power had ever possessed, yet it couldn't manage its finances effectively. The silver passed through Spanish hands but didn't stay there. It flowed out to pay for imports, to service debts, to fund wars. Spain, despite its American empire, remained economically weak, while countries like the Netherlands and England, which had no direct access to American precious metals, grew wealthy through trade and industry. The price revolution also prompted some of the first serious thinking about how money and prices relate to each other. A French scholar named Jean Bodin wrote in 1568 about the connection between the abundance of gold and silver and rising prices. This was an early articulation of what we now call the quantity theory of money, the idea that the amount of money in circulation affects price levels. This might seem obvious to us now, but at the time it was a novel insight. People hadn't previously thought systematically about money as a quantity that could be too large or too small relative to the needs of the economy. While silver from Potosi was transforming European monetary systems, Spain's colonial empire was also reshaping global trade patterns. The Spanish established a regular route across the Pacific, from Acapulco in Mexico to Manila in the Philippines. The Manila Galleon, as it was known, made 1 or 2 voyages per year, carrying silver from Mexico to Manila, where it was traded for Chinese goods, silk, porcelain, spices. These goods would then be carried back to Mexico and forwarded to Spain, or sold in the Americas. This trans-Pacific trade route connected the American silver mines to Asian markets, creating what was arguably the first truly global trading system. Silver mined by forced labor in Bolivia might end up as currency in China. Chinese silk might end up as clothing for Spanish nobles. Mexican chocolate might be consumed in Manila. The world was becoming interconnected in ways that would have been unimaginable a century earlier. But this interconnection also meant that economic disruptions in one region could affect distant places. A decline in silver production in the Americas could cause monetary shortages in China. Political instability in Europe could disrupt trade routes that connected three continents. The global economy was emerging, with all the opportunities and vulnerabilities that entailed. The Portuguese, meanwhile, were establishing their own colonial empire, focused primarily on Africa, India, and Brazil. Portuguese ships carried African gold and ivory to Europe, and later, as Brazil's potential became apparent, Brazilian gold would supplement Spanish silver. The Portuguese also dominated the spice trade from India and the East Indies, at least until Dutch and English competition eroded their monopoly in the early 17th century. The 17th century brought new innovations in how money and commerce were organized, and many of these innovations emerged from an unlikely source, a small, swampy region of northwest Europe that had recently won its independence from Spain. The Dutch Republic, as it came to be known, would become the financial center of the world, demonstrating that wealth came not from controlling gold and silver mines, but from organizing trade, credit, and capital efficiently. The Dutch had several advantages. Their location at the mouth of major rivers gave them access to the interior of Europe. Their long coastline and maritime tradition made them natural traders, and their political structure, a republic rather than a monarchy, with power distributed among merchants and town councils, meant that commercial interests had a direct voice in government policy. The Dutch were, in many ways, a nation of merchants, and they organized their society accordingly. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, or VOC, was established. Now, trading companies were not new. The Portuguese and the English already had their own East India companies, but the VOC was organized differently, in a way that would have lasting implications for how large enterprises were structured and financed. The VOC was what we now call a joint stock company. Instead of being owned by a single merchant or family, it was owned by shareholders, people who bought shares in the company and thereby owned a portion of it. This structure allowed the company to raise enormous amounts of capital. Thousands of people, from wealthy merchants to modest shopkeepers, bought shares in the VOC. Some shares were quite small. A single share might cost the equivalent of a few months' wages for a skilled craftsman. This made investing accessible to a broader class of people than ever before. The shares could be bought and sold. If you owned VOC shares and needed money, you didn't have to wait for the company to pay dividends. You could simply sell your shares to someone else. And this trading of shares happened in Amsterdam at what became the world's first true stock exchange. Investors would gather at the exchange to buy and sell shares not just in the VOC but in other ventures as well. Prices fluctuated based on news. Reports of successful voyages raised prices, while news of ships lost at sea depressed them. This was financial innovation on a scale that hadn't been seen before. For the first time, ordinary people could invest in commercial ventures and benefit from their success. Risk was spread across thousands of shareholders rather than concentrated in the hands of a few merchants. And capital could be raised quickly and in large amounts, enabling ventures that would have been impossible for any single merchant or family to undertake. The VOC used this capital to establish a trading empire in Asia. The company maintained fortified trading posts, negotiated treaties, fought wars, and even governed territories. At its height, the VOC employed thousands of sailors and soldiers, operated hundreds of ships, and paid substantial dividends to its shareholders. Between 1602 and 1800, the VOC sent nearly 1 million Europeans to Asia on 4,700 ships, and returned with cargoes of spices, silk, porcelain, and other goods worth vast sums. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of the VOC from our perspective is what it represented about the changing nature of capital and investment. The VOC wasn't just a trading company, it was a financial instrument. VOC shares became a form of wealth in themselves, something that could be held, traded, and used as collateral for loans. The company's success demonstrated that wealth could be created not just by mining gold or growing crops, but by organizing commerce efficiently and allowing many people to participate in the profits. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, where VOC shares and other securities were traded, became a sophisticated financial market. Investors developed techniques that we still use today. They bought on margin, borrowing money to purchase shares in the hope that prices would rise. They sold short, betting that prices would fall. They traded options, contracts giving the right to buy or sell shares at a specified price in the future. These techniques could be profitable, but they also introduced new risks, as the Dutch would discover during the tulip mania of the 1630s. Tulip mania. If you're still awake at this point, this story might amuse you, or perhaps lull you further towards sleep with its sheer absurdity. Tulips had been introduced to Europe from the Ottoman Empire in the mid-16th century. The flowers were exotic, beautiful, and highly prized by wealthy collectors. Some tulip bulbs produced flowers with striking striped patterns. We now know these patterns were caused by a virus, but at the time they were simply considered rare and desirable. In the 1630s, tulip bulbs became objects of speculation. People began buying bulbs not to plant them and enjoy the flowers, but to resell them at a profit. Prices rose, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. A single bulb of a rare variety might sell for the price of a house. Tulip bulbs were traded on markets, with buyers and sellers agreeing on prices for bulbs that were still in the ground, not yet ready to be dug up and delivered. The speculation reached its peak in the winter of 1636 to 1637. Ordinary people, weavers, carpenters, shopkeepers, were drawn into the market, hoping to make quick profits. Some sold their possessions to buy tulip bulbs. Others bought on credit, planning to repay the loans when they sold the bulbs at higher prices. The market for tulips had become disconnected from any rational assessment of what a tulip bulb was actually worth. And then, in February 1637, the market collapsed. It's not entirely clear what triggered it. Perhaps a buyer defaulted on a purchase, or perhaps people simply realized that the prices were absurd. But once prices started falling, panic set in. Everyone tried to sell at once, and there were no buyers. The market evaporated. People who had paid enormous sums for bulbs found they were worth almost nothing. Those who had bought on credit were ruined. The tulip mania is often cited as history's first speculative bubble, though as we've seen, there were earlier episodes of financial mania. What makes tulip mania notable is that it involved ordinary people, not just wealthy merchants or nobles, and that it demonstrated how speculation could spread through a society once there were established markets and financial instruments. The availability of credit, the ability to trade on margin, the excitement of rising prices, all of these combined to create conditions where rationality gave way to fever. The economic impact of the tulip crash was probably less severe than sometimes portrayed. Most tulip contracts were settled for a small fraction of their nominal value, and the Dutch economy continued to prosper. But the episode left a lasting impression, a cautionary tale about the dangers of speculative excess. While the Dutch were innovating in finance and trade, The English were developing their own commercial institutions. The Bank of England, which we mentioned earlier, was chartered in 1694. Unlike the VOC, which was a trading company, the Bank of England was created specifically to manage government debt and to issue currency. The English government was engaged in expensive wars with France, and the bank provided a mechanism for financing those wars through bonds. The Bank of England issued paper notes that were redeemable for gold on demand. These notes began to circulate as money, supplementing the gold and silver coins that already existed. The bank's notes were trusted because the bank maintained reserves of gold sufficient to redeem the notes if holders requested it. And as long as that trust held, the notes functioned as money, accepted in payment and used to settle debts. This system had a subtle but important implication. The bank could issue more notes than it had gold in its vaults, as long as it maintained enough gold to meet the demands of those who wanted to redeem their notes. Most people, most of the time, were content to hold and use the paper notes rather than demanding gold. This meant the money supply could be expanded beyond the physical quantity of gold available, allowing the economy to grow without being constrained by the supply of precious metals. But this system depended entirely on trust. If people lost confidence in the bank's ability to redeem notes for gold, if they all showed up demanding gold at once, the system would collapse. This was the vulnerability at the heart of fractional reserve banking, as this practice came to be called. It was efficient and it enabled economic growth, but it required careful management and, above all, the maintenance of public confidence. The English also developed a sophisticated market for government bonds. These bonds, which paid regular interest and would eventually be repaid, became a form of investment for wealthy individuals and institutions. The market for bonds allowed the government to borrow large sums without having to negotiate individual loans from bankers. And the existence of a secondary market where bonds could be bought and sold meant that investors weren't locked into holding bonds until maturity. If they needed cash, they could sell their bonds to someone else. This market for government debt would become a model for other countries. Over the 18th and 19th centuries, most European governments would adopt similar systems, issuing bonds to finance wars, infrastructure, and other projects. The bond market became one of the central institutions of modern finance, a mechanism for transferring savings from those who had capital to governments and institutions that needed it. The 18th century was a period of gradual but profound transformation in how people thought about money, trade, and economic activity. It was during this century that economics began to emerge as a distinct field of study, and that some of the fundamental questions about the nature of money were posed and tentatively answered. One of the more interesting developments of this period occurred not in the great financial centres of London or Amsterdam, but in Scotland. Scotland in the early 18th century was significantly poorer than England. It had a smaller population, less fertile land, and fewer natural resources. Yet Scottish banks developed innovations that would influence banking practice for centuries to come. The Bank of Scotland was established in 1695, just 1 year after the Bank of England. But unlike the Bank of England, which was closely tied to the government and focused on managing public debt, the Bank of Scotland was a commercial bank, serving private customers. It accepted deposits, made loans, and issued paper banknotes. These notes were backed not by gold reserves alone, but by the bank's portfolio of loans and investments. This might sound unremarkable, but it represented a subtle shift in thinking about what money was and how it worked. A banknote backed purely by gold reserves is essentially a receipt for gold stored in a vault. But a banknote backed by loans, by the productive economic activity those loans supported, was something different. It was money created through credit, through the expectation of future productivity. Scottish banks also pioneered the concept of branch banking. Rather than operating from a single location, Scottish banks established branch offices in smaller towns throughout the country. This allowed them to serve customers in rural areas and to gather deposits from a wider population. It also helped spread risk. If one region experienced economic difficulty, branches in other regions might still be profitable. Another Scottish innovation was the cash credit account, which functioned much like a modern overdraft facility. A customer could borrow up to a specified limit, repay the loan and borrow again, paying interest only on the amount actually borrowed. This was more flexible than a traditional loan, which had to be repaid in full before a new loan could be obtained. The cash credit account allowed merchants and farmers to manage the irregular cash flows that characterized their businesses. These Scottish innovations helped make banking services available to a broader segment of society. Banking was no longer just for wealthy merchants and nobles. Shopkeepers, farmers, and small manufacturers could access credit, which in turn allowed them to expand their businesses. This democratization of finance contributed to Scotland's economic development in the 18th century, helping transform it from a poor backwater into a centre of manufacturing and intellectual achievement. It was in Scotland, incidentally, that one of the most influential economic thinkers of all time lived and worked. Adam Smith, born in Kirkcaldy in 1723, would publish The Wealth of Nations in 1776, and in doing so, he would help establish economics as a systematic field of study. Smith's book covered many topics, but one of his key insights concerned the nature of money and its role in facilitating trade. Smith described how money emerged naturally from the needs of commerce. In a barter economy, trade is limited by the need for a double coincidence of wants. But once a particular commodity, gold, silver, or anything else that's widely desired, comes to be accepted as a medium of exchange, trade becomes much easier. Money, Smith argued, is not wealth, but rather a tool for facilitating the exchange of real goods and services. A nation's wealth consists not of how much gold and silver it possesses, but of the productive capacity of its people and the goods they produce. This might seem obvious now, but in Smith's time it was a radical departure from prevailing mercantilist thinking, which held that a nation's wealth was measured by its stock of precious metals. Mercantilist policies focused on accumulating gold and silver through trade surpluses and colonial extraction. Smith argued this was misguided. If money is simply a medium of exchange, then having more of it doesn't make a nation wealthier. It just means prices will be higher. Real wealth comes from production and trade. Smith also wrote about banking, though his views were somewhat conservative. He was skeptical of paper money not backed by gold, fearing that banks might issue too much of it, causing inflation. He approved of Scottish banking practices which he saw as prudent, but worried that less responsible banks might destabilise the economy. His concerns were not unfounded, as we'll see. While Smith was writing in Scotland, momentous events were unfolding in Britain's North American colonies. The American Revolution, which began in 1775, would have significant implications for monetary history. The Continental Congress, lacking the power to tax, financed the war by printing paper money, the Continental dollar. The problem was that they printed far too much of it. As we touched on earlier, the Continental dollar collapsed in value, teaching Americans a lasting lesson about the dangers of unbacked paper currency. After independence, the United States faced a currency crisis. The Constitution, ratified in 1788, gave the federal government the power to coin money but was silent on paper money. The first Bank of the United States, chartered in 1791, was an attempt to create a national banking system similar to the Bank of England. It issued paper notes, made loans, and served as a depository for government funds. But the bank was controversial. Many Americans, particularly those in agricultural regions, distrusted banks and paper money. They preferred hard currency, gold and silver coins they could hold in their hands. The first bank's charter was allowed to expire in 1811. A second Bank of the United States was chartered in 1816, but it too faced fierce opposition. President Andrew Jackson, elected in 1828, was a vocal opponent of the bank, which he saw as an institution that favored wealthy Eastern merchants at the expense of common people. Jackson vetoed the bill to recharter the bank in 1832, and when its charter expired in 1836, the United States was left without a central bank. This situation would persist until the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Without a central bank, the American monetary system became chaotic. State-chartered banks issued their own paper notes, each backed by varying levels of gold and silver reserves. Some banks were sound and conservative, maintaining sufficient reserves and earning reputations for reliability. Others were not. So-called wildcat banks, banks established in remote locations where it was difficult for note holders to demand redemption, issued notes far in excess of their reserves. A merchant accepting payment had to know which banks could be trusted and which couldn't. Banknote reporters published regularly, listing exchange rates for notes from different banks. A note from a reputable Boston bank might trade at face value, while a note from a questionable bank in Illinois might be worth only 50 or 60 cents on the dollar. This system, chaotic as it was, did have one advantage. It allowed banking to expand rapidly into frontier regions. As settlers moved west, banks followed, providing the credit needed to establish farms, build towns, and develop infrastructure. But the lack of regulation and the absence of any lender of last resort meant that banking panics were frequent. When depositors lost confidence in a bank and rushed to withdraw their money, the bank would often fail, unable to convert all its loans and investments into cash quickly enough to meet withdrawals. And because banks were interconnected through various credit relationships, the failure of one bank could trigger failures of others, creating cascading financial crises. Back in Europe, the late 18th century saw the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and this transformation would have profound effects on money and finance. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain, in the textile mills of Lancashire, and the iron foundries of the Midlands. These new industries required capital, money to build factories, purchase machinery, and hire workers. Traditional sources of capital, such as wealthy merchants investing their own money, were insufficient for the scale of investment required. Joint stock companies, which we discussed in connection with the Dutch East India Company, became more common for industrial enterprises. Investors could buy shares in a textile mill or a canal company, spreading risk and allowing larger projects to be undertaken. Insurance companies and pension funds began to accumulate substantial pools of capital, which they invested in bonds and stocks, providing another source of financing for industrial development. The Industrial Revolution also changed the nature of work and wages, which in turn affected the monetary system. As people moved from farms to factories, they began to be paid in regular wages rather than earning income from harvests or piecework. This shift increased the demand for currency, particularly small denomination coins and notes that could be used to pay workers weekly or daily. Employers needed to have cash on hand for payrolls, which increased the velocity of money, the speed at which money circulates through the economy. Banks responded by expanding their note issue and by providing more services to manufacturers. Overdraft facilities, bills of exchange, and other credit instruments became standard tools of business finance. The relationship between banks and industry became increasingly close, with banks not just providing loans but often taking equity stakes in industrial enterprises and sitting on their boards of directors. The expansion of industry also required better transportation networks, which in turn required enormous capital investment. Canals were built, connecting industrial centres to ports and markets. Roads were improved, and in the early 19th century, railways began to be constructed, requiring levels of investment that dwarfed anything that had come before. The financing of railways would drive further development of capital markets, with railway stocks and bonds becoming major instruments for investment. The 19th century would see money and finance transformed by a combination of technological innovation, institutional development, and the gradual adoption of what came to be known as the gold standard. This period, particularly the years between 1870 and 1914, is sometimes called the first era of globalization, when capital, goods, and people moved across borders with a freedom that wouldn't be seen again until the late 20th century. But before we reach that golden age, we should discuss how the gold standard itself came to be. As we've noted, both gold and silver had long served as money, often simultaneously. This bimetallic system worked adequately when the relative values of gold and silver were stable, but new discoveries of precious metals could upset the balance. The California gold rush of 1849, for instance, increased the supply of gold, making it somewhat less valuable relative to silver. Britain had been on a de facto gold standard since the early 18th century, as we mentioned when discussing Isaac Newton's miscalculation as master of the mint. But it wasn't until 1821 that Britain formally adopted the gold standard, making gold the sole basis for its currency. Bank of England notes were freely convertible to gold at a fixed rate. Other countries watched Britain's experience, and gradually they too began to adopt gold standards. Germany did so in 1871, following its unification and its receipt of a large gold indemnity from France after the Franco-Prussian War. The United States, after a period of debate, formally adopted the gold standard in 1900. By 1914, most of the world's major economies were on the gold standard. The gold standard had certain attractive features. It imposed discipline on governments, making it difficult to print money excessively because the money supply was tied to gold reserves. It facilitated international trade by providing fixed exchange rates. A British pound was worth a certain amount of gold, as was an American dollar, so the exchange rate between pounds and dollars was simply the ratio of their gold contents. And it provided a kind of automatic mechanism for correcting trade imbalances. A country that imported more than it exported would see gold flow out to pay for those imports, reducing its money supply and causing prices to fall, which would make its goods more competitive and eventually reverse the trade deficit. Or at least that was the theory. In practice, the gold standard was less automatic and less benign than its proponents claimed. The system required countries to subordinate domestic economic goals to the maintenance of gold convertibility. If a country faced a recession, the logical response would be to expand the money supply and lower interest rates to stimulate economic activity. But under the gold standard, if gold was flowing out of the country, the required response was the opposite: contract the money supply and raise interest rates to attract gold back. The gold standard, in other words, could make recessions worse. Nevertheless, the gold standard persisted for several decades, and during that time, the world economy grew rapidly. International trade expanded. Capital flowed from wealthy countries to developing ones, financing railways, ports, and other infrastructure. British investors in particular sent enormous sums overseas, to the Americas, to Australia, to India, to anywhere that promised returns. By 1914, Britain had foreign investments worth roughly twice its annual national income. This export of capital helped develop other economies while providing British investors with income from abroad. The railway boom of the 19th century deserves particular attention, as it transformed not just transportation, but also finance. Railways required immense capital investment. Building a railway meant purchasing land, constructing bridges and tunnels, laying thousands of miles of track, and buying locomotives and cars. No individual or partnership had sufficient capital for such projects. Railways had to be financed through the sale of stocks and bonds to the public. Railway stocks became one of the primary investments available to ordinary middle-class savers. A clerk or shopkeeper who had managed to accumulate some savings might invest in railway shares, hoping for dividends and capital appreciation. This was speculative, of course. Some railways were profitable, others failed. But it represented a democratization of investment. Wealth wasn't just accumulated by merchants and landowners anymore. It could be built through careful investment in securities. The railway boom also produced spectacular financial manias and crashes. In Britain, the railway mania of the 1840s saw hundreds of railway companies chartered, often with little regard for whether the proposed routes made economic sense. Investors, caught up in enthusiasm for the new technology, poured money into railway shares. When it became clear that many of these railways would never be profitable, the bubble burst, causing substantial losses. If you're feeling a sense of déjà vu at this point, given our earlier discussion of tulip mania and the South Sea bubble, you're noticing a pattern. Financial markets, it seems, are prone to periodic episodes of excessive optimism followed by painful corrections. But despite these crashes, the railway networks that were built transformed economies. Goods could be transported quickly and cheaply over long distances. Perishable foods that once had to be consumed locally could now be shipped to distant markets. Industrial raw materials could be moved efficiently from mines and forests to factories, and information could travel faster as railways carried mail and newspapers, reducing the time lag in communications. This last point about information is worth dwelling on, because the 19th century saw a revolution in communications that would have profound effects on finance. The invention of the telegraph in the 1840s meant that information could be transmitted almost instantaneously over long distances. A merchant in New York could learn about crop failures in Europe within hours rather than weeks. A banker in London could receive news of political upheaval in South America almost immediately. This acceleration of information flow changed financial markets fundamentally. Stock prices began to respond more quickly to news. Arbitrage opportunities, the ability to profit from price differences between markets, became harder to exploit because prices in different locations converged more rapidly, and financial panics could spread more quickly, as bad news in one market was immediately transmitted to others. The telegraph also enabled the development of wire transfer systems. Instead of physically transporting gold or banknotes to settle accounts, banks could send telegraphic instructions to transfer funds. This made large transactions easier and safer. By the late 19th century, a sophisticated international payment system had emerged, based on telegraph communications and clearing arrangements between banks in different countries. During this period, central banking, as we now understand it, was also taking shape. The Bank of England, while still technically a private institution, had evolved into something like a central bank. It held the reserves of other banks. It acted as lender of last resort during financial panics, providing emergency loans to solvent banks facing temporary liquidity problems. And it managed the gold standard, adjusting interest rates to influence gold flows and maintain convertibility. Other countries observed British practice and developed their own central banks. The Reichsbank in Germany, the Banque de France, and eventually the Federal Reserve in the United States all took on similar roles, managing the currency, overseeing the banking system, and acting as lender of last resort. The theory of central banking was articulated most clearly by Walter Bagehot, a British journalist and economist, in his 1873 book Lombard Street. Bagehot argued that during a financial panic, the central bank should lend freely, at a penalty rate, against good collateral. This would provide liquidity to the banking system, preventing solvent banks from failing due to temporary cash shortages while still discouraging reckless behavior. Bagehot's dictum would become one of the fundamental principles of central banking, though its application would be debated and refined over the decades to come. The challenge was always to provide enough liquidity to prevent systemic collapse, without encouraging excessive risk-taking by banks that expected to be rescued if their bets went bad. The late 19th century also saw the growth of what we might call modern accounting and auditing practices. As businesses became larger and more complex, and as ownership became separated from management through the sale of shares to public investors, there was an increased need for reliable financial information. Shareholders needed to know whether the companies they invested in were actually profitable. Creditors needed to assess whether borrowers could repay their loans. Professional accountants and auditors emerged to meet this need. They developed standardized methods for recording transactions, valuing assets, and calculating profits. The accounting profession established standards and ethical codes, and gradually the idea took hold that companies should publish regular financial statements, audited by independent accountants, so that investors could make informed decisions. This might seem like a dry, technical development, and if it's helping lull you towards sleep, then it's serving its purpose. But it was actually quite important. Reliable financial information is essential for the efficient allocation of capital. If investors can't trust the numbers, if companies can manipulate their accounts to appear more profitable than they really are, then capital will flow to the wrong places and resources will be wasted. The development of accounting standards and auditing practices helped create the transparency necessary for modern capital markets to function. By the early 20th century, the world had what appeared to be a smoothly functioning international monetary and financial system. The gold standard provided stability and predictability. Capital flowed freely across borders. Trade was expanding. Technology was advancing. Banks and financial markets were sophisticated and, it seemed, well regulated. There was a sense of confidence, even complacency, about the durability of these arrangements. But this system, as stable as it appeared, rested on foundations that would prove fragile. It depended on continued peace, on central banks cooperating to maintain gold convertibility, and on governments resisting the temptation to subordinate currency stability to domestic political pressures. And it required that the supply of gold grow roughly in line with the needs of the expanding world economy, which was far from certain. In August 1914, Europe descended into war. What began as a local conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia quickly escalated as alliance systems pulled in the major powers. Germany, France, Russia, Britain, all found themselves at war, and they would remain so for more than 4 years. The Great War, as it was called before there was a Second World War, to distinguish it from, would transform not just the political map of Europe, but also the international monetary system that had seemed so stable just months before. Wars are expensive, far more expensive than peacetime governments typically anticipate. The belligerent nations needed to pay for armies, weapons, ammunition, food, uniforms, transportation, all the machinery of modern industrial warfare. Tax revenues, even when increased, were insufficient, so governments borrowed. They issued war bonds to their citizens, appealing to patriotism and promising repayment with interest after victory. And they borrowed from abroad, particularly from the United States, which remained neutral until 1917. But borrowing wasn't enough either. Governments also expanded their money supplies, in effect printing money to pay for the war. This was difficult to do under the gold standard, which limited how much money could be issued, so the belligerent nations suspended gold convertibility. Britain left the gold standard in 1914. Other countries followed. The money in people's pockets was no longer redeemable for gold. It was simply paper, backed by nothing more than the government's promise to honour it. This suspension was expected to be temporary, just until the war ended. But the war dragged on far longer than anyone had anticipated. By the time the armistice was signed in November 1918, all the major European economies had inflated their money supplies substantially. Prices had risen. Government debts had swollen to levels that would have been unimaginable before the war. And the gold standard, that anchor of pre-war monetary stability, had been swept away. The immediate post-war years were chaotic. Several countries experienced hyperinflation, not just inflation, but inflation so severe that money became nearly worthless. Germany is the most famous example. The Weimar Republic, the German government established after the war, faced crushing reparations demands from the victorious Allies. Unable to raise sufficient taxes and unable to borrow, the government resorted to printing money. The amount of currency in circulation exploded. Prices rose not just daily, but hourly. By 1923, it took billions of marks to buy what a single mark had purchased before the war. Workers were paid twice a day and rushed to spend their wages immediately before prices rose further. People carried money in wheelbarrows. Savings were wiped out. Anyone who had held bonds or kept money in a bank account saw their wealth evaporate. The social and psychological effects were devastating. An entire generation learned that money could become worthless, that savings meant nothing, that the economic order was fragile and could collapse without warning. Germany eventually stabilized its currency by introducing a new mark, backed by land rather than gold, and by finally balancing the government budget. But the damage was done. The hyperinflation of 1923 would leave scars on German society and would contribute in complex ways to the political instability that eventually brought the Nazis to power. Other countries also experienced severe inflation, though not as extreme as Germany's. Austria, Hungary, Poland, Russia all saw their currencies collapse in the early 1920s. Russia's inflation was particularly severe, as the Bolshevik government, having taken power in 1917, simply printed rubles to pay for everything, causing the currency to become worthless. Eventually, the Soviet government abandoned money almost entirely for a time, attempting to organize the economy through direct allocation of goods rather than through monetary exchange. This experiment in abolishing money failed, and by the mid-1920s the Soviets had reintroduced currency. Britain, France, and the United States avoided hyperinflation, but they too faced monetary challenges. Britain returned to the gold standard in 1925. At the pre-war parity, meaning a pound was once again convertible to the same amount of gold it had been in 1914. This decision, championed by Winston Churchill, who was then Chancellor of the Exchequer, was controversial. Critics, including the economist John Maynard Keynes, argued that the pre-war parity overvalued the pound given how much prices had risen during and after the war. An overvalued currency made British exports expensive and uncompetitive, hurting British industry and contributing to persistent unemployment. Keynes argued that Britain should have either returned to gold at a lower rate, accepting that the pound was worth less than before the war, or should have abandoned the gold standard entirely and managed the currency to support domestic employment. But this view was not yet mainstream. Most policymakers believed the gold standard was essential for monetary stability, and that maintaining it, even at the cost of economic pain, was necessary. The United States, which had become the world's largest creditor nation during the war, also faced challenges. American banks had lent heavily to European governments, and the repayment of these loans was tied up with Germany's reparations payments. If Germany couldn't pay reparations, France and Britain couldn't fully repay their war debts to the United States. The entire international financial system had become a complex web of debts, all of which ultimately depended on Germany's ability to generate sufficient surplus to make reparations payments. This was a precarious arrangement. Throughout the 1920s, American capital flowed to Europe, particularly to Germany, helping to stabilize the situation. German companies and governments borrowed from American banks and investors, using the funds to rebuild and to make reparations payments. This recycling of capital worked reasonably well as long as American investors remained confident. But confidence, as we've seen repeatedly in this long history, can be fragile. In October 1929, the American stock market crashed. Share prices, which had risen dramatically throughout the late 1920s in what many recognized, even at the time, as a speculative bubble, collapsed. Investors who had borrowed money to buy stocks faced margin calls and were forced to sell, driving prices down further. Banks that had lent to investors faced losses, and most importantly, the crash shattered confidence. The stock market crash itself might not have caused a severe economic depression. Stock market crashes had happened before, and economies had recovered. But what happened next turned a financial crisis into the Great Depression. American banks, facing losses and fearing further withdrawals, began restricting credit. Businesses couldn't obtain loans. Consumers cut back on spending. Demand fell, causing businesses to lay off workers, which reduced demand further, creating a downward spiral. And critically, the international flow of capital reversed. American investors stopped lending to Europe and began trying to withdraw their funds. This put enormous pressure on European currencies. Countries tried to maintain gold convertibility, which meant contracting their money supplies and raising interest rates, making the economic situation worse. One by one, countries were forced off the gold standard. Britain left gold in 1931. The United States followed in 1933. By the mid-1930s, the international gold standard had effectively collapsed. The economic consequences were catastrophic. In the United States, unemployment reached 25%. Industrial production fell by half. Banks failed by the thousands. In Germany, unemployment was even higher, creating the conditions for political extremism. International trade contracted sharply as countries erected tariff barriers in futile attempts to protect domestic industries. The world economy, which had been increasingly integrated, fragmented into competing economic blocs. This experience prompted a fundamental reconsideration of economic policy and monetary management. The prevailing orthodoxy before the Depression had been that governments should balance their budgets, maintain the gold standard, and allow markets to adjust naturally. But this approach had manifestly failed. The Depression was too severe, too prolonged, to be explained as simply a natural market correction. John Maynard Keynes emerged as the leading critic of orthodox economics. In his 1936 book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, Keynes argued that economies could get stuck in prolonged depressions with high unemployment, and that government intervention, through deficit spending and monetary expansion, was necessary to restore full employment. Saving the gold standard was less important than saving the economy and putting people back to work. Keynes's ideas were controversial, and many economists rejected them, but the experience of the Depression made many policymakers more willing to experiment. In the United States, President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs involved massive government spending on public works, relief programs, and financial reform. Whether these programs ended the Depression is debated. Many economists argue that it was World War II, not the New Deal, that finally restored full employment, but they did represent a significant departure from previous policy. As war loomed again in the late 1930s, governments had learned at least one lesson from World War I. They would need to manage their economies carefully to sustain a long conflict. The monetary experimentation of the Depression years, the abandonment of the gold standard, the willingness to use government spending and monetary expansion, all of these would be employed again, but this time in a more coordinated and deliberate way. And as World War II progressed, planners in the Allied nations began thinking about what the post-war monetary system should look like. They didn't want to return to the instability of the interwar years, with competitive devaluations and collapsing currencies. But they also couldn't simply restore the old gold standard, which had proven too rigid. What emerged from these discussions would be a new system, one that tried to combine stability with flexibility, the Bretton Woods system. In July 1944, while World War II still raged, representatives from 44 Allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their task was to design a new international monetary system, one that would avoid the competitive devaluations and monetary chaos that had characterized the interwar period. The system they created would shape the global economy for nearly 3 decades. The Bretton Woods system, as it came to be called, was essentially a compromise between two visions. The British, represented by John Maynard Keynes, wanted a system that would provide countries with flexibility to pursue domestic economic goals without being constrained by rigid exchange rates. The Americans, represented by Harry Dexter White of the US Treasury, wanted a system that would restore stability and predictability to international finance. What emerged was something of a hybrid. Under the Bretton Woods system, the US dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies were then pegged to the dollar at fixed exchange rates. Countries were required to maintain these exchange rates, intervening in currency markets to buy or sell their currencies as needed, to keep them within a narrow band around the official rate. But unlike the classical gold standard, countries could, in extreme circumstances, adjust their exchange rates with the approval of the newly created International Monetary Fund, or IMF. This system had a certain logic. The United States held most of the world's gold reserves at the end of the war, roughly 2/3 of all monetary gold. The dollar was the strongest currency, and the American economy, untouched by the physical destruction that had ravaged Europe and Asia, was by far the world's largest. Making the dollar the center of the international monetary system seemed natural, even inevitable. The system worked reasonably well for about 2 decades. The post-war period saw remarkable economic growth. Europe and Japan rebuilt their shattered economies with the help of American aid, most notably the Marshall Plan. International trade expanded rapidly. The fixed exchange rates provided stability and predictability, encouraging cross-border commerce and investment. And the International Monetary Fund, along with its sister institution, the World Bank, provided a framework for international economic cooperation. But the Bretton Woods system had a fundamental flaw, one that would eventually prove fatal. As the global economy grew, the demand for dollars grew with it, because dollars were needed for international trade and as reserves for central banks. The United States supplied these dollars primarily by running trade deficits, importing more than it exported, sending dollars abroad to pay for the difference. But the more dollars accumulated abroad, the harder it became for the United States to maintain the promise to convert dollars to gold at $35 per ounce. There simply wasn't enough gold to back all the dollars in circulation. This dilemma was identified as early as 1960 by the economist Robert Triffin, and it became known as the Triffin paradox. For the system to work, the US had to run deficits to supply dollars to the world. But running persistent deficits undermined confidence in the dollar's convertibility to gold. It was a contradiction built into the system's foundation. By the late 1960s, the strain was showing. Other countries, particularly France under President Charles de Gaulle, began converting their dollar holdings into gold, skeptical that the US could maintain convertibility indefinitely. The US gold reserves were declining, and the United States was facing inflationary pressures from the costs of the Vietnam War and domestic social programs. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would suspend the convertibility of dollars to gold. This suspension was supposed to be temporary, a pause while a new system could be negotiated. But it proved permanent. The Bretton Woods system was effectively over. After several years of negotiation and various attempts to salvage some version of fixed exchange rates, the world moved to a system of floating exchange rates. Currencies would now be valued by markets, rising and falling based on supply and demand, with occasional government intervention, but no fixed parities. This transition to floating exchange rates marked a profound shift. For centuries, money had been linked to precious metals, first to various metals, then increasingly to gold. Even when paper money circulated, it was theoretically convertible to gold. But after 1971, the major currencies, the dollar, the pound, the yen, the mark, had no metal backing. They were fiat currencies, money by government decree. A dollar was valuable because the US government said it was, because people accepted it in payment, and because the government managed the currency to maintain its purchasing power. But you couldn't take a dollar to the government and demand gold in return. This made many people uneasy. Without the discipline of gold convertibility, what would prevent governments from printing money excessively? The experience of the 1970s seemed to confirm these fears. Inflation accelerated in most Western countries, reaching double digits by the late 1970s. The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979, when oil-producing countries dramatically raised prices, contributed to inflation and economic stagnation, a combination dubbed stagflation. Central banks struggled to control inflation in this new era. The old rules, which had been designed for systems with fixed exchange rates and gold backing, no longer applied. It took time to develop new frameworks for managing fiat currencies. By the early 1980s, central banks had adopted policies of targeting inflation directly, raising interest rates aggressively to squeeze inflation out of the system. This worked, but at the cost of severe recessions in the early 1980s. Once inflation was brought under control, the modern era of central banking began to take shape. Central banks became focused on maintaining price stability, keeping inflation low and predictable, while also supporting economic growth and employment when possible. They communicated more transparently with the public about their goals and methods, and they gained independence from direct political control, operating at arm's length from elected governments to insulate monetary policy from short-term political pressures. The late 20th century also saw the acceleration of financial globalization. Capital controls, restrictions on moving money across borders, were gradually dismantled. Financial institutions expanded internationally, and technology transformed how money moved and how financial markets operated. The rise of computers and telecommunications meant that currency trading, which had once been conducted by telephone and telex, could now happen electronically at enormous speed and volume. By the end of the 20th century, trillions of dollars were being traded daily in foreign exchange markets. This globalization of finance brought benefits. Capital could flow to where it was most productive, regardless of national borders. Countries could borrow internationally to finance development. Risks could be diversified globally. But it also brought new vulnerabilities. Financial crises could spread rapidly from one country to another. The Mexican peso crisis of 1994, the Asian financial crisis of 1997, the Russian default of 1998, all demonstrated that in an interconnected financial system, trouble in one region could quickly affect others. The early 21st century brought further innovations and challenges. The euro, introduced in 1999, created a single currency for much of Europe, an experiment in monetary union without political union whose tensions would become apparent during the European debt crisis that began in 2010. The global financial crisis of 2008, triggered by problems in US mortgage markets, became the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, requiring massive central bank interventions and government bailouts to prevent a complete collapse of the financial system. And then there was the emergence of digital money in forms that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. Credit cards had begun replacing cash for many transactions in the late 20th century. But in the 21st century, digital payments accelerated. Smartphones enabled mobile payment systems. Cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, introduced in 2009, proposed a form of money that operated independently of any government or central bank, based on cryptographic algorithms and distributed ledgers. Whether cryptocurrencies represent the future of money or simply an interesting experiment remains unclear. They have not yet achieved widespread use as actual currencies. Most people who own Bitcoin treat it as a speculative investment rather than using it for daily transactions. And governments have proven resistant to ceding control over currency to decentralized systems. But the technology underlying cryptocurrencies, blockchain and distributed ledger technology may have applications in how traditional financial systems operate. Central banks themselves have begun exploring digital currencies. Several have launched or are developing official digital currencies, central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, that would function like cash but in digital form. These would combine the convenience of digital payments with the backing and stability of government-issued currency. China has moved furthest in this direction, conducting large-scale trials of a digital yuan. Other countries are watching closely, and so we arrive at the present day. more than 5,000 years after humans first began keeping clay tablets to record debts in Mesopotamia. Money has evolved from cattle and cowrie shells to bronze coins to gold-backed paper notes to digital entries in computer databases. It has been shaped by human needs and human ingenuity, by wars and trade, by trust and by the occasional collapse of that trust. The essential function of money, to facilitate exchange, to store value, to measure worth, remains unchanged. But the forms it takes continue to evolve, and they will undoubtedly continue evolving in ways we can't fully predict. What seems certain is that as long as humans engage in trade and economic activity, we will need some form of money. And the story of how we create, manage, and sometimes mismanage that money will continue to unfold, quietly shaping our lives in ways both profound and prosaic. Thank you for accompanying me on this long, leisurely journey through the history of money. Whether you've stayed awake to the end, absorbing these many centuries of economic evolution, or you drifted off somewhere along the way, lulled by tales of medieval tally sticks or discussions of the Triffin paradox, I hope you found this time worthwhile. Sleep well, or if you're still alert, rest easy knowing that tomorrow, money will still be there, still facilitating our exchanges, still causing occasional crises, and still quietly doing its work of making our complex modern economy possible. Please consider subscribing to the Drowsy Economist. Your support means a great deal to our growing channel. Thank you, and sweet dreams.